So glad to be back. I actually used to come to Full Stack, I think in 2000, like, long time ago, 2014. Anyway, are we good, sir? Can you please put that away? Put it on silent. Whoever did it. Yeah. Okay, so I gave Jeff a list of topics, and he thought continuous delivery would be a good one. So I'm hoping it resonates with everybody here. This right now is my life. We at PCR are a continuous delivery shop, and we're headed towards continuous deployment. So who am I? I am Richard Clayton. I'm a principal software engineer at PCR. You can find me on Twitter. I like to talk shit about politics, so probably not a good place to find me. But I have my blog on Silverback, which I thought was going to be better than Medium when I bought it. Didn't really work out that way. And you can find me on GitHub. Okay. Yeah. It's because R. Clayton was taken by someone else, and I found out it was me, and I forgot my password. I shit you not. And I was like, you know what? I'm committed to this now, so it's my life. So anyway, my goals today are to provide a practical understanding of what continuous integration and continuous delivery is, and I'm going to demonstrate it through anecdote. So I'm going to give you an example of the development process with continuous delivery, and then we're going to discuss the principles of continuous delivery, like what it's all about and why we do it. And then I'm going to offer you some advice on how you can achieve it. So I know, to be honest, I don't think most companies actually are a full continuous deployment shop. So I think there's something to take away. And I'm still learning myself. So I'm hoping I can help you achieve the next level. So the first thing I want to talk about is these terms: continuous integration, continuous delivery, continuous deployment. Right? It is a terminology soup. Right? A lot of times people get it confused. I actually got it confused when I sent the talk to Jeff, because I didn't realize that what I was trying to say was continuous deployment is within reach, not continuous delivery. But I sent the thing out, and I found out I was wrong. So continuous integration is actually fairly simple. It means that you can check in your code, and there's some other machine somewhere out there in the world that is building it and testing it and validating your code, right? To whatever level that you tell it to validate at. So it's not magic. If you write crappy code and you don't have good tests, it's not going to be highly validated. So continuous integration is about getting code off your box and testing it somewhere else. Continuous delivery is about packaging that code and shipping it to your production or staging systems, right? It's about deploying that code in an automated fashion. Doesn't mean that you're continuously deploying to production. It just means that there's some kind of facility in your environment to get it to your deployment environments. And then finally, the dream is continuous deployment. And that is when you commit code, it gets validated and it ends up in production without any human intervention. It doesn't mean that it's released. It just means that it's there. And there are techniques to turn off features, and I want to talk a little bit about that today. So I wanted to start with a little anecdote. And the reason why I wanted to do this was I realized I spent a long time trying to figure out how to deliver these lessons, and I realized that what I struggled with at first with continuous deployment, continuous delivery, is that I didn't know what it looked like. And so I was constantly trying to get technology to do something that I didn't know was an actual process that had to actually be achieved through human behavior and not technology. So let's start with your daily development. So we begin our morning by pulling tasks off the backlog. And let's say hypothetically that I needed to implement Stripe like I did last week. So we're going to implement Stripe payments. And so, at some point, our team had groomed this task, and we came up with a checklist of items that had to get done. So the first thing we do is drag the task into progress. All right. Now I know that I have to work in a code base to get this done. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that my code base is fresh. So I pull master. I make sure I'm using the right version of Node. I install any dependencies that someone else might have added. I build it, I test it, I run the linter against it. This is me verifying that the code that I'm going to start working on is in a working state. And then, usually if you're any kind of script kiddie, you're going to automate this with my good morning script. I usually do this and I go get coffee, and you get that little Mac noise. It's like, good morning, Richard, your coffee's done. So anyway, we began development, furiously coding. So in a continuously delivery environment, we're working on a feature here. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a release flag. Right? And we'll talk a little bit about what that is. The second thing is, all right, I'm going to modify the UI. I got to add Stripe payments. Right now, we only accept PayPal. So what I need to do is when I develop my front end, I need to turn this code off, because I know it's going to get into production, and I don't want it to be on in production, but I do want it to be in production. And I know that's a conundrum, right? So I have a little bit of infrastructure that will basically look at flags that are set for that user. And if the flag is toggled, it'll show my Pay with Stripe. So you see that here with my Pay with Stripe. But my Pay with PayPal is obviously still on. Next thing I do, write a UI test, right? Then I go and I verify it and be like, all right, is it working? Looks good. All right, now I have to work on the back end. So, obviously this stuff doesn't live in isolation, and I got to keep track of the Stripe payments because of accounting. They're really picky about this kind of stuff. And so I got to create a migration for my payments table. I got to expand my model a little bit, right? So we use TypeScript. So here I'm like adding an enumeration and a field to represent that now we have multiple types in our system. And then I have to modify, we send flyers at PHR, so that's why you have this like flyers theme here. So I'm going to add the payment type to my database model. This is a migration. This is using Flyway, which is actually done in SQL. And then because our system's going to live in a state where I've deployed this code and there's a notion of Stripe, but it's not actually like in production, I have to account for the fact that now my database has changed and I have this model that has expanded, that is now there, but that I right now only support PayPal. So this is actually a migration that's called a recurring migration, which means every time migrations run, this gets ran again. And so this is a neat way to make sure that your database is constantly in sync. So this task that says basically if the payment type is null, set the payment type to PayPal, is my way of handling a default case. So my production system now is going to keep up to date when these migrations run, even though my Stripe implementation isn't out yet. All right, and then I'm going to do some backend development. Now my post flyers route is, it's being used in production, and I'm going to add a whole bunch of new like Stripe stuff. So I don't want to break stuff in production, and this code's going to get there. So I have more infrastructure that does stuff where it changes like the default behavior, which is just post a flyer, and it adds an option where if a flag is set, that the user that calls that route is going to have this handler executed instead of the default handler. So here I'm accounting for the fact that there's two different implementations on the back end. Right? And I write my unit tests. I write some integration tests. And then I verify everything works. And then I push to master. Now, one thing that you didn't see is me branch. I don't need a branch. Branching's for suckers. All right, snack time. Okay, so in the meantime, while I'm getting my hot dog and petting my dog, the system is responding to these changes. So I push to master. That GitHub notifies Circle CI. I know a lot of people here use Circle CI. Circle CI is running my build pipeline. It's going to build my code. It's going to run my unit tests. It's going to package that code. It's going to push that code into a Docker registry, which is just how we deploy our apps. It's going to run my migrations against staging, and it's going to deploy my code. So literally every commit on master is going to staging. It's constantly going there. All right, and when it's done, I get a nice little message in Slack that says, hey, your stuff has been deployed to staging. Kauai is our staging. For some reason, someone had a Hawaii theme in mind, and that's what we're stuck with. So it's not a bad theme, but like the annoying thing is we go and we add new environments, and Maui's our production environment, and we're like, we need to add a new one. And like the number of Hawaiian islands is getting finite. And then it's like Molokini, right? And like no one wants to type Molokini all the time, right? So anyway, and then everybody struggles to spell the environment names. Anyway, so when I'm done, we use Jira, but I didn't want to pollute our Jira stuff with a fake task. So Apparently Jeff doesn't have a problem with that at Planning Center. Anyway, we drag it into ready for QA. And I don't necessarily need to do this, but I'm going to be nice, and I'm gonna tell Quality Man, which is our nickname for our QA guy, hey, this thing's ready to test. But he already knows it's ready to test because it's in his QA board. And so here he can look at it on his QA board and see, hey, I have this task that's ready for verification. And notice how I added like the release flag? And then he starts by saying, all right, I want to stage this release. So even though the code went to staging, it wasn't actually on in staging. And we do that because, if you have a finite number of staging environments and you have a whole bunch of developers, you don't want to trample each other with features, right? And you want to keep you want to keep the deltas that the QA person has to test really low, right? So anyway, he's gonna say, all right, I'm ready to QA this. So this is literally in Slack, and he's like, all right, let's stage this flag. Now, staging the flag doesn't actually mean a deployment. It just means, hey, we're updating the database that says this is the code that's working, that's on, and our flagging infrastructure will tell the UI, okay, turn this on. So he does some testing, and he basically comes back and he says, yo, I really don't like the copy that you put on this. I want to change it. Instead of saying pay, I want to say pay with credit card. I don't know, it's pretty arbitrary, but let's pretend like that's a thing that he cares about. So I'm like, all right, cool. I'm feeling fat and happy after my snack. I don't want to pull the environment down. I'm just going to edit it directly on GitHub, right? Because that's what us developers do, right? And so I do it. Right, build failure. And I'm like, what? This should have worked, right? So I pull it down, and I look at it, and I go, oh my gosh. I started with a single quote and ended with a double quote. And GitHub didn't, GitHub didn't get that for me. It didn't verify that for me or tell me not to commit. But my CI system did, right? Even though I can dangerously edit code and do stupid stuff on GitHub, it doesn't actually cause the staging environment to get updated. It doesn't cause any kind of damage to our running system, which is one of the tenets of CI. So anyway, I fixed my malfunction, and I push it. Yay, it works, right? I tell Quality Man, all right, it's ready for you to QA again. He's like, cool. He verifies it. Yep, says pay with credit card. And then he's like, all right, I'm going to pre-release it, which basically means, all right, I'm saying that it's good, but it's not going to go out to production. And then he goes and plays video games. And then while he's playing video games, because he pre-released it, what that means in our system, and it can mean something different in other people's systems, but what happens is Slack gets his hook. Slack tells our flagging system, hey, change this to pre-release. Our flagging system will then tag that commit on master of that repo, and that triggers a build in Circle CI. And Circle CI will then build, test, package, migrate, and deploy the code to production. So now, just from that simple flow, without anybody touching anything else, this is not magic. We didn't touch any other system, manually push a deployment. This thing's in production, but it's off, right? So it's there. No one has to do anything. It's ready to be basically released whenever we want to release it. So he drags a task into verified. He might even go into production system and verify that it's there, and then sometime in the near future, we will release the feature when we're ready. And typically this will happen because if your feature slices are really small, which they should be, you're typically not going to release just one feature. You'll release a batch of features because they're a coherent set, they're an epic of capability that you want to release. And we're done. Yay. Not with a talk, just with the deployment process. So he drags it over into released, and that's it. That's the flow for an entire task for a feature. Okay, so why do I provide this example? So there are a couple principles with continuous delivery, and I think this example maybe marginally demonstrates them. The first is that you have to build quality into your process, right? So we have unit tests, we have integration tests, we have linters, we have all these things that sometimes developers hate. They're there to build confidence in our code base, to ensure that if we do something like dangerously commit through GitHub, we don't break the system. We always work in small batches, and our batches may actually be, a feature might be implemented in multiple batches. So like you might expand and contract your database over multiple commits because you know that you can't change running code in one big deployment, right? The computers perform all the repetitive tasks. You didn't see any developers actually deploying code. You're constantly pursuing continuous improvements in your process, right? So what we saw was a pretty gnarly process actually in my mind, in that I'm like telling QA, hey, this feature's ready, because he should be getting notifications. And so one thing that we could do is we can improve it by removing some of the communication pieces and then having like the backlog drive the release. And finally, everybody's responsible. If you break the build, you're responsible for going in and fixing it. If you deploy code and we unflag it in production and it's bad, you're responsible for making sure that it gets fixed and it gets rolled out. So it's about developers taking responsibility for QA, being a part of design, doing things that are typically outside of what we traditionally think of as developer roles. And if you don't believe me that these are the principles, this is the link to Jez Humble's book on continuous delivery, which is like 500 pages. I do not recommend reading it. Unless you need a sleep aid, it's really boring. All right, roadmap to CD. So not too much longer, bear with me, it's like 4 slides. Okay, first thing you need to do to get to continuous deployment is you need to get your stuff building on another machine, right? And I know this sounds really dumb because given the fact that you guys are interested in technology and you're here today, I bet that you guys are using CI. But the number one thing that Jez Humble says in his book that people, like he encountered, and given the fact that it was like 5 years ago or 6 years ago that he wrote the book, so maybe things have changed, but a lot of people still aren't using version control, right? Like that's actually a thing. A lot of people don't build code by executing it off a CI machine or pushing it to a different machine to get it built. When you're building your stuff, report your build failures, right? And then you need to jump on it when it fails. Increasing your confidence through unit test coverage. So like not only doing unit tests, but actually checking your branches and making sure that you've actually caught all the edge cases in your code. Because when you get into the system, when you get into continuous delivery, you're shipping code, right? You're getting it out into staging, you're getting it out into production. And so you have to be confident when you actually do commit code that it's going to work. And then finally, reiterating the fact that you have to correct your builds immediately. All right, second step is automating deployments. You need to first start at packaging your code. Is your code portable across machines, or do you have to have a sysadmin come in and install dependencies to get it to work on your box? Docker is a great tool for getting this done. There are a myriad of other technologies to do it, but I think the point is make sure that you can actually package your code through an automated script and get it onto a remote machine. Like that's your model for deployment. Automate the configuration lifecycle. So one of the things that still trips us up is when people add configuration or the need for configuration, but no one ever does it in production. And so you get all of our failed deployments nowadays are because someone forgot to add an environment variable. So automating that piece is huge, right? So if one idea is if someone's going to set an environment variable for development, they also have to set it for staging in production. This is really dumb, but this tripped us up. Make sure that your app can start, in your CI tests. We've had cases where we've sent code to staging and the app didn't actually start. Wonderful. And we're troubleshooting the deployment, and it's like, oh yeah, because the app doesn't start. Automate your, first start by automating your deployments locally. So you should be able to do whatever your CI machine does. So if you're struggling with automated deployments, do it first on your local box, right? If that involves running Terraform or whatever, right? Do it locally, and then ship that script, ship those scripts over to your CI server or whatever system you're using. And finally, the script that you use in your local environment needs to be the one that you use in your CI environment. It's all about consistency in CI. Deploying automatically. So one thing that I really struggled with was adopting some pretty simple conventions on how and when to deploy. So I would ask yourselves, what in your system or your process triggers a deployment, right? Because a lot of times, it could just be a manual process, or it could be waiting until product says go ahead and do it. For us, what we came to the conclusion was anything that goes onto master goes into staging. And then we gate our production deploys simply by tagging or merging onto a production branch. So you have, this is really common, particularly if you get flow, you're going to have a branch that represents your production system. And what you should do is just have your CI system deploy whenever you get commits to that branch. You know, you're not to continuous deployment yet, so you may need to gate your production deployments. That's totally fine. And then finally, always work in small deltas, right? Because small code drift is typically the easiest way to guarantee a successful deployment. But if you're like literally working off a branch for 10 days and you decide you're going to merge it, chances are it's probably going to fail when it gets onto master. And then roll forward. So you see a lot of, so one of the things that also tripped me up is trying to design a system for like automated rollbacks and like a blue-green system or whatever. And one of the things that we came to the conclusion of was that there are great tools like Kubernetes that will basically prevent a deployment if the liveness or the liveness probes or the readiness probes don't work. And you don't need to necessarily engineer some amazing system that like catches errors through smoke tests and does rollbacks. Start with something small where you just basically say, we're going to deploy it, and if it breaks, we're going to fix it, and then we're going to roll forward. We're not going to try to design a system that rolls back or goes to the last appropriate state. Because if you're making small changes, the chances are those changes are so small that an easy fix will get you back to a working state. And then finally, continuous deployment. You're going to have to get to flags or toggles. Does anybody use feature flags now? Yeah? Honestly, we do ghetto feature flags. We're working on a much better system, but like right now for our web apps, it's literally local state in the browser. So like we just basically say, hey, set this, you know, this local session variable, and if you have it, turn the flag on. That's not great. You want to automate that piece, but the point is that you can get there very simply, like within a couple hours of work. You obviously want to increase, if you're going to go to full continuous deployment where every commit is going to production, you've got to increase your confidence with end-to-end testing and integration testing. Smoke tests, incredibly important. I think they're in the same line as integration testing. And then if you have the time, invest in automated rollbacks. Okay, conclusion. I hope this provided some practical understanding of CI or CD. And I demonstrated how it would work in a hypothetical development environment. And hopefully you learned some of the principles of continuous delivery and you're thinking, oh, this is great. And I offered some okay advice on how to start incorporating it into your process immediately. All right, questions? No? Sure. So smoke test would be like a, it's a test to verify a rollout of a deployment, right? So like, or they'll call it like a canary test, right? Because canary in the coal mines, like they're the first to die before a human. So it might be a marginal set of tests that verify the liveness or the okayness of your deployment, but don't necessarily do a deep end-to-end test. So like, perfect example of why you wouldn't want to do a deep end-to-end test against production is you don't want to like simulate a payment in production unless you can, right? And so you may be limited because you don't want to generate false data in your system with what you can do in production. So that they'll typically call a canary or smoke test like that limited, like verify liveness kind of test.
Gotcha. So in the case of submitting payment,
Mm-hmm.
you might just kind of like make sure that the buttons that activate that performance there, maybe put a few inputs in there, like just to make sure that it's
Totally, yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, you know, and if you get, so one of the things to add is if you get really sophisticated with feature flags are not just like, hey, is this feature on or not? It can be state that's specific to that flag. So one of the things that we're trying to do personally at PCHAR is we're going to roll out different keys based on what flag's on. So like you know how Stripe does like a sandbox key for like payments. So like if you're the QA person and you get into, you know, to testing the system, we can detect who you are and we can say, all right, for this you know, backend route, we're going to use the sandbox key for Stripe and not the production key. So we won't actually execute a payment. So you can get really creative with it. Cool. Yeah.
Sounds like you're going to have a lot of branching logic for all the feature flags and the
It absolutely can cause problems. And and it's more reason to have like unit tests and integration tests that validate like that those work. And one reason why you verify in staging. But actually, one of the interesting things that I've seen, and we don't have it implemented, is to actually write lint rules for how long your feature flags stay in there, like stay in the system. So that's arbitrary, it's arbitrary conditional logic in your system, and a feature flag shouldn't live more than, like, I think they say like a month. I think Martin Fowler's like a month is probably too long. Because the whole point of this is to be very agile and to be releasing features as fast as possible, validating them, and then turning them off, like turning off the conditional logic and swapping towards that implementation that you verified. And so like linting can help. Particularly, I can imagine like maybe you write a comment, above it, and you put like a timestamp. And like certain, like, I'm not familiar with Ruby, but with like TS lint, it's really easy to write arbitrary lint rules. And so we might do something like that. Yeah. Anybody else? Just out of curiosity, how many people are doing CI versus yeah, let's just start with CI. CI? Continuous delivery? Anybody doing continuous deployment? You guys are? Yeah? Is that because you only code in production? Okay. I'm just imagining like Vim, and you're like just in the production system, and you're like, yeah, this is the. What's that? You do branch? Okay. Yeah.
A branch goes to staging. Anything merchant master goes to production.
Awesome.
All of our systems on production.
That's awesome. And I would ask too, like, how long did it take you to get to that? Yeah. That's actually a really great point too. The team has to decide to want to. The hardest thing that we had in getting to continuous delivery was getting people to get on board with it, because people are not comfortable with the fact that they're launching code out into staging and production pretty rapidly. And so I would ask, like, how much of an investment did you make in testing? Like, how did you build the confidence to get to continuous deployment? Are you confident now?
Every app's different.
Sure.
We have multiple apps. So
Okay.
for services, how long did it take, Tanner?
I mean, once it was available, I was like, do it.
Yeah.
I think the motivation for it was more, it was our hurdle for developers to have to think about deployments, and so the motivation was more, let's take that time, let's give that time back, and make sure that it just happens.
Yeah. So now that you've hit it, like, let's imagine you start your next company. Is that the first thing that you do when you, like, as CTO, you try to get people to continuous deployment? Yeah. I don't know. He has like no ambition. Just like, you will never leave this company. So for me, it's like there's for me, there's like no going back. So at Peach Chart, like when we started, so Mike and I started around. Mike started, I think, February, and I started April. Anyway, it was yeah. In engineering years, it was like 30 years ago. Yeah, last March. But I would say in our first 6 months of working, and we wrote a ton of code, we probably deployed 2 times. 2 times. We had this DevOps contractor that created this gnarly ass like ECS deployment system with Terraform, and it took like, honestly, it would take like 30 minutes for a deploy. And we were on the verge of getting rid of them, and we basically were like, we want Kubernetes, and we're gonna manage the whole like ops cycle of deployment. And in that first month of getting there, it wasn't pretty, but I think we deployed like 30 times. Today, we weren't even releasing. We were just syncing production because we hadn't released stuff in a while. We're not at continuous deployment yet. But today, we deployed 35 services, and it was under an hour. Actually, the funny thing is we were backed up on Circle CI because we didn't have enough build tasks, right? And not a single one failed. And I think the point is that like you can get to continuous delivery pretty fast, and you're going to build confidence in your process extremely fast. I don't sit up and worry at night about, my delivery system delivering code anymore. I used to. I've been on some government contracts where it was like the height of anxiety was deployment day, right? And like you're literally zipping up your jars and you're like deploying it, you're SSHing and like SCPing them to machines, and it's absolute nightmare. Anyway, we're in a different place now, and you can get there. So I should wrap this up because I've probably taken way more than 20 minutes. If you are interested in this presentation, you can get there online. This is actually on a Git repo. I'm using this cool technology called Git Pitch, which is like, this is a markdown presentation. Yeah, if I can learn how to. And so you can, it literally just looks at the repo and it builds a presentation off of it. So anyway, yeah, it's there if you wanna pick it up. This guy who does Git Pitch is like a single guy in England, and he's making a go of it. So please, patronize his stuff. And if you have any questions for me, just find me afterwards. Cool. All right.